Nicholas Coureas studied ancient and medieval history at the University of London and currently works as a senior researcher at the Cyprus Research Center in Nicosia. He has published extensively on Eleusinian Cyprus with a particular focus on its commercial and ecclesiastical history. Some of his published works include a number of monographs, including The Minorities of Cyprus, along with the translation of the Chronicle of Amati with Dr. Peter Edbury, and most recently, The Burgesses of Eleusinian Cyprus. It is a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you very much. Nice to be with you as well.
Awesome. I guess to start us off, is it possible you can give us a brief overview of the political changes that leads into the Frankish period?
Well, first, in 30 BC, Cyprus was annexed to the Roman Empire following Octavian's defeat of Mark Antony, and it remained a Roman province, on and off, right until 1191, because the so-called Byzantine Empire is really a continuation of the Roman Empire in the East. The Byzantines never called themselves Byzantines. They called themselves Romans, even though they were ethnically Greeks, Armenians, Albanians, Slavs. They considered themselves politically the heirs of the Roman Empire. They were. In the classical period, before Christianity, the Greeks called themselves Hellenes, like they do now. They Hellenes. But when Christianity came along, there was a split among the Greeks. Some of the Greeks embraced Christianity, and other Greeks didn't like it because they believed in the 12 gods. As far as they were concerned, that Jesus Christ was a Jewish troublemaker who was crucified, and they didn't want to become Christians. The Greeks who didn't want to become Christians continued to call themselves Hellenes, and so the Greeks who did become Christians were embarrassed to call themselves this, and they called themselves Romans. And so once the Greeks or most of them became Christians, they continued to call themselves Romans right on, up until the early 19th century. And I mean, even now in Greek popular music, the word Romeos, coming from Romeos, is still used. So Cyprus was part of the Roman and Byzantine Empire. And what drew me to Lusignan Cyprus was that it is the only long period in the island's history when it was an independent state. Before the Lusignan period, Cyprus was part of the Roman and later Byzantine Empire. It was part of the Empire of the Ptolemies, the successor of Alexander the Great. Before that, it was part of the Persian Empire, and then before that, it was part of the Egyptian, the Assyrian empires. After the Lusignan period, it became a Venetian colony. Then it became an Ottoman province. The independence it acquired in 1960 was not real independence. It had and still has three guarantor powers. That's one guarantor power has bases, the British. Another guarantor power, Turkey, occupies 37% of the island's territory. And the third guarantor power is Greece, which did a coup in 1974. So for me, the Lusignan period is very interesting because it's a period where for nearly 3 centuries, Cyprus was independent. Now, the fact that Cyprus was independent doesn't necessarily mean that the majority of the population ruled. Then, as now, the Greeks were a majority, but the rulers of Cyprus were Franks. Now, these Franks came in part from the Latin states, the Frankish states founded in the 12th century as a result of the Crusades, and in part they came straight over from Western Europe. And obviously, the first generation came from abroad, but successive generations, the second and third, were born and brought up in Cyprus. And so they were Cypriot. They weren't Greek Cypriots, they weren't Armenian or Maronites, but they were Frankish Cypriots. And they actually called themselves Cypriots in some of the chronicles, notably the chronicle of Philippe de Roy, which is actually called in French, richest, the deeds of the Cypriots. So very early on, the Franks, even if they didn't identify with the majority Greek culture or any of the other cultures, they identified with the islands. They considered themselves Cypriots. And this interested me because even though it was a small kingdom, and even though they had troubles with bigger neighbors, such as the Genoese and the Mamluks, they were able on and off to survive. And that is quite a feat. And the other thing is that even though you did have religious and interethnic tensions, generally there was a peace on the islands, and where there wasn't peace, it was punctuated either by foreign invasions, the peace was interrupted by foreign invasions, or by civil wars. So the Lusignans, despite their small numbers, did manage to rule the Greek majority population and the large number of Eastern Christians without any significant revolts. And that is quite remarkable. The other thing that's remarkable is that Cyprus really was multicultural. because you had Franks from Western Europe and from the Latin states of Palestine and Syria. You had the Greeks, you had Armenians, you had the various groups of Syrian Christians, you had Copts of Egypt. So it was a multiracial society in the medieval period. And of course, they didn't understand multiracialism the way we understand it in the late 20th and 21st centuries. You did have dislikes and tensions, but there was a remarkable absence of interracial violence. And, that is remarkable. The other thing that's remarkable is that in the fields of art and architecture, you had a lot of cultural fusion, especially in iconography, in architecture, especially church architecture. St. George of the Greeks in Famagusta is an astonishing blend of Gothic and Greek Orthodox architecture. You also have the influence of Armenian and Eastern Christians, which is shows in the iconography and also in the production of manuscripts. You have the Chronicles of Cyprus. Some of them are written in Old French, others are written in Italian, and some are written in the Cypriot Greek, which during this period becomes a written medium. Another thing that is extraordinary is that Cyprus is alone in the Greek world in having a medieval law code written in colloquial Cypriot Greek. Although you do have medieval Greek literature consisting mainly of poems and some prose compositions, Cyprus is unique in this period in that you have law code actually translated into medieval Cypriot Greek. So there's tremendous cultural diversity. And there's also, of course, a lot of Latin correspondence, because the papal correspondence, which is thousands of letters, is all written in Latin. And you also have notarial deeds prepared by public notaries for the commercial activities, mainly contracts for the export of goods, for sales, for purchases. And all these are also prepared in Latin. So it's a multilingual society with Latin, Italian, Old French, Greek, Armenian, and Syriac, all rubbing shoulders.
I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, and you also said that this was a multicultural society, which we're going to spend, I hope, quite a bit of time discussing that. Earlier, you said that the Franks would come to...
Sorry, the word Franks here has a broader designation. It really refers to people of West European origin, Spanish, French, of the Roman Catholic faith. They were all called Franks. It does not refer to the Frankish tribes that overran the Roman Empire.
Would one of their markers be their use of the French language, or would, say, Catalan, would they be considered Frankish as well, even though they would have spoken Catalan?
They would be still considered Frankish. The British, the English would be considered Frankish, so would the Italians. The markers were not really linguistic. I mean, you could say that they were Latin-based languages, okay? Like Italian, French, Catalan. But the real marker was that they geographically came ultimately from Western Europe. That is to say, from the countries west of Germany and Italy, including Germany.
So sometimes I see the word Latin being used as an, for a lack of a better word, as an ethnic identifier. And then other times I see Frankish. So what's the difference between the two?
The difference is this. Byzantium, the Byzantines considered themselves to be the continuators of the Roman Empire. And in fact, they were, because the word Byzantine was invented by French historians in the 17th century, because they considered the Eastern Roman Empire to be degenerate and debased. And so they wanted a word that would distinguish it from the classical Rome. The inhabitants of the Roman Empire called themselves Romei in Greek, and in Latin that would be Romanus. However, the Byzantines, or Romans as they call themselves, had a problem. If they were Romans, what were they going to call the inhabitants of Rome and Western Europe? They couldn't call them Romans because they themselves were Romans. So they called them Latins. So the word Latin in the context of West Europeans of the Roman Catholic faith was actually invented by the Byzantines because they wanted to distinguish between themselves, they were the real Romans, and the others happened to be Latins. But this word was actually picked up by modern historians as a very convenient designation for West Europeans in the medieval period. Now, I realize it can be confusing for people who think of Latins as the inhabitants of the area around ancient Rome. And it was simply a word which the Byzantines used to describe the West Europeans, and which modern historians have also used to describe West Europeans in the Middle Ages in the Eastern Mediterranean. So Latins really describes West Europeans. I mean, the marker is geographical. They come from Western Europe, but above all, it's religious. They are Roman Catholics. All Latins have to be Roman Catholics. Apart from, of course, you do have some heretics like the cathedrals and the Waldensians, but they don't come to Cyprus. They don't impinge on the Latin presence, the West European presence in the East Mediterranean.
Now, you did mention that at some point, the Franks living on Cyprus would call themselves Chihuahua, which of course refers to we would say Kypriotes in medieval Cypriot, medieval Greek. Now, was this inadequate though in describing their identity beyond their connection to the island?
Well, as you probably know, in modern Cyprus, present-day Cyprus, there is no Cypriot that doesn't have a prefix. You have Greek Cypriots, Turkish Cypriots, Maronite Cypriots, Armenian Cypriots, and Latin Cypriots. Okay, there are no Cypriot Cypriots for good or ill. Now, in the medieval times, it was very similar because the travelers who come to Cyprus, they refer to Greeks, Franks, Copts, Syrians, Jacobites. So you have various ethnic and religious groups. And also depends on language. I mean, if you look at Greek sources from Cyprus, the Cypriots or the Greek Cypriots call themselves Romans, like the Byzantines, throughout. Okay? And they call the Franks either Franks or even Latins. Okay? And the Armenians are called Armenians, Armenides, and the Syrians are called Syrians. So you have different ethnic groups, but the people who, funnily enough, use the designation Cypriot most are the Franks. In the chronicles, they call themselves Chihuahua. They actually call themselves Cypriots. Of course, they knew that they spoke French. And Stephen de Lusignan, who was a member of the Lusignan royal house in the Venetian times, by the rich time, of course, Cyprus was a Venetian colony. He says that the Lusignans and the Lusignan nobility identified most of all with France because that's where most of them ultimately came from. So the link with Western Europe, and especially France, was never completely severed. Indeed, only a limited number of Greeks, Armenians, and Syrians joined the nobility. But the Franks of Cyprus also identified, at least geographically, with Cyprus. They called themselves Cypriots. The Assises of Cyprus were originally written in Old French in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and they were compiled, cobbled together, if you like, by the middle of the 13th century. By the early 14th century, they have been translated into Cypriot Greek, and the ethnic designations are very interesting. In the French version, the Greeks are called Grec, Greeks. But in the Greek version, they're called Romans. Okay, and so in the Greek versions, the Greeks call themselves Romans, and the remainder of the population are called either Franks or Syrians or Armenians. The Muslims are known as Saracens. Right. The Egyptians are known as Myrides because Misr is the Egyptian for Egypt. Yeah. And so you do have ethnic designations, but sometimes they switch from language to a language. I mean, that's why even though the Greeks are called Greeks by the actual the Latins, the West Europeans, and sometimes in during the time of the conquest, the Greeks were called Griffons. Now, the griffon was an animal that was half eagle, half lion. It was supposed to be very aggressive and rapacious. And because at that time, in the late 12th century, there was a lot of hostility between the Latins and the Greeks. The Latins actually called the Greeks Griffons. And they have references to the wicked Greeks and how they are schismatics. But now that Cyprus has been conquered, the Church of Cyprus will be returned to the bosom of the Roman Catholic Church. And this is also applicable in a wider context. There's a castle in the Peloponnese in Greece near the village of Akova. And the name of the castle is Mate Griffon, which means Greek killer. And there's another castle in Sicily where you also had a lot of Greeks in the Middle Ages with exactly the same name. So the name Griffon was used in the late 12th and early 13th century as an aggressive designation of Greeks. I mean, it was a racist, if you like. But later, as the Greeks were conquered and they became more integrated into the Frankish states, they were simply called Greeks by the Franks, and they always continued to call themselves Romans, Greeks themselves, both on Cyprus and elsewhere.
Now, in the Byzantine period, before we get to Richard the Lionheart's conquering of Cyprus, was this a homogeneous group of Romans, to use the appropriate term, in Cyprus at the time, or were there a variety of different groups before 1191?
Cyprus was never homogeneous, not even from the dawn of time. when the Greeks settled in Cyprus in around 1100 BC, the Phoenicians settled there at the same time. And you had the native Cypriots, the so-called Ethio-Cypriots. And in the 2nd century BC, they were joined by Jews. So Cyprus, from very early on, even before the time of Jesus Christ, was multi-racial. And during the Byzantine period, the Byzantines deliberately implanted colonies of Armenians and Syrians in Cyprus, especially Maronites, because they were considered good warriors. And so you had Greeks, Armenians, Syrians, and later in the 12th century, Venetian merchants started trading with Cyprus. They started buying up land to produce wine and grain, wheat and barley for export to Venice and other West European countries. So you had Western settlement. When Richard arrived in Cyprus, he landed in Limassol, and he was welcomed by Western, mainly Venetian merchants there. So even before the conquest, Cyprus had various ethnic groups. The Greeks were the majority, but they coexisted with other groups. The Armenians, the Syrians, small Jewish community, and of course, the Franks, the Venetians.
So let's start just to give some context to listeners about the political changes that are happening at this time. Now, I definitely want to talk mostly about the cultural and the social changes that mark this period. But let's just give some context. Richard the Lionheart, he's on his way to participate in the Third Crusade, and the ship of his wife, I believe, is blown off course and ends up in Cyprus. Can you just give us a little overview of what happens politically at this period and how Cyprus falls out of control of the Byzantines or the Eastern Roman Empire and lands ultimately in the hands of Guy de Lusignan?
Yes, well, actually, Cyprus fell out of control of the Byzantine Empire in 1184, 7 years before Richard arrived. What happened in 1184 is that the Komnenian dynasty in Constantinople was overthrown by someone called Isaac Angelus, and a new dynasty, the Angeli, were established in its place. Constantinople was the capital of the Byzantine Empire, also known as New Rome. Now, in Cyprus, there was a governor called Isaac Komnenos. Of course, being a member of the Komnenian royal family, which had been overthrown, he didn't like the Angeli, and so he proclaimed himself emperor. He succeeded. He broke away from the Byzantine Empire. And the Byzantines sent a fleet to conquer Cyprus from him. What did he do? In order to stop the Byzantines, he enlisted the services of the Sicilians, a Sicilian admiral called Margaritone. And in a battle that took place off Cyprus, the Byzantine fleet was destroyed. Now, unfortunately for Isaac, his Sicilian allies also happened to be enemies of King Richard I. Because of that, Richard didn't like Isaac. And generally, in the chroniclers, the Norman chroniclers who wrote the chronicles of the time and related to the conquest of Cyprus, also didn't like Isaac. They said that he was a great friend of Saladin, the Muslim conqueror of much of the kingdom of Jerusalem, that Isaac and Saladin had mixed their blood in friendship, that Isaac hated Latins, he loved killing them. Basically, they gave Isaac a very bad press. And so when Richard landed, the idea of conquering Cyprus was already in his head because he landed forcibly. I mean, apparently Isaac mistreated Berengaria, his wife, who landed in Cyprus before him, and he may have mistreated her because he was an ally of the Sicilians who didn't like the English. Anyway, Richard landed forcibly in Limassol. His fleet defeated the ground forces Isaac had in Limassol, and so Isaac's forces were forced to retreat. At that time, Isaac had the Greek and Armenian troops at his disposal, and they fought various battles with Isaac. King Richard's forces fought with Isaac in the hinterland of Limassol and in the area of just south of Nicosia. And in the end, they were able to conquer Cyprus in 1 month. Isaac went to the castle of Botavento, and he was taken in their chains. So Richard conquered Cyprus from Isaac in 1 month. Now, Isaac, of course, was not a Byzantine governor by that time, he was a usurper. And when Richard conquered Cyprus, the Byzantine emperor said that he should return Cyprus to Byzantium, because after all, it had been a Byzantine province. And of course, Richard had no intention of doing this. He was also told by the King of France that since they had agreed that any conquest they made should be shared by one half. Half of Cyprus should be given to the King of France, Philip Augustus. This again, Richard refused. He said that those conquests only referred to the Holy Land. And since he conquered Cyprus by himself, he was going to keep it. In fact, he didn't keep it. He sold it first to the Templars. The Templars kept it for 8 months. And when the Greeks revolted against them, they rebelled against them on Easter Day of 1192 because they didn't like the new taxes the Templars imposed. The Templars crushed the Greek rebellion. But because there were few, they decided they didn't want Cyprus. They gave it back to Richard, and he sold it the second time to Guy de Lusignan. Now, Guy de Lusignan was the dispossessed king of Jerusalem. The Franks in Jerusalem had been defeated by Salahuddin at the Battle of Hattin, and the Muslims conquered Jerusalem and much of the hinterland of the Frankish states. The Franks were able to hang on to some coastal areas like Acre and Tyre and Beirut and Antioch, but the hinterland remained Muslim. And so because Guy was a king who did not have a kingdom, he became Lord of Cyprus. He actually bought Cyprus from Richard. And later his brother Aimery became the first king of Cyprus in 1197. He was crowned officially by Pope Celestine III, who sent a representative, Bishop Conrad of Hildesheim, to crown Aimery. And this bishop also crowned Leo, king of Armenia. Now this was very important. It meant that from 1197 onwards, there were 2 Latin kingdoms in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Kingdom of Cilicia and Armenia and the Kingdom of Cyprus. The Kingdom of Cilicia and Armenia lasted until 1375 when it was overrun by the Mamluks, but the Kingdom of Cyprus lasted until 1474 when the Venetians took over, and the Venetians held it until 1571. So the Lusignans and the Venetians held Cyprus for 380 years. It's a very, very long time.
We can assume that there's going to be changes that happens to Cyprus when it gets handed over essentially to the West. Now, Neophytos the Recluse, and that's Saint Aios Neophytos, he writes that at this time there is a depopulation of Cyprus, and presumably, I would think, this is something that's overstated. What is he referring to? Is this true? Was there a depopulation, or was this more of a change of upper class control?
When Richard conquered Cyprus, because a lot of the nobles of Cyprus didn't like Isaac anyway, they came over to Richard's side, and they asked Richard if they could be ruled according to the laws of Emmanuel Komnenos, the last Byzantine emperor who held Cyprus. And Richard said okay, but he made them shave their beards to show that they were now, under Latin rule, and he made them pay taxes. But what happened is that when Richard left Cyprus to fight the Muslims in Palestine, there was a revolt, okay? This revolt was crushed by Richard's lieutenant, Robert of Turner. Then, when the Templars took Cyprus, there was a second revolt. And after the second revolt, the nobles of Cyprus left for Constantinople. Why did they leave for Constantinople? It was because the Byzantine nobles of Cyprus were not native Cypriots. They all originated from Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. And when the Templars took Cyprus and later handed it over to Guy de Lusignan, they realized they had no future there, and they actually migrated. So the Cypriots who leave Cyprus are the noble upper class who are of Byzantine origin anyway. Now, who is left? The people who are left are, of course, the Cypriot peasants, the Greeks, the Armenians, the Assyrians, and also you have some Greek landowners and the Syrian landowners who are not as rich and powerful as the Byzantine landowners, but they stay on Cyprus, and they continue to stay on Cyprus throughout the period of Lusignan rule. So you don't have a Greek aristocracy or a Syrian aristocracy, but you do have independent Greek and Syrian landowners. So no, the migration is overstated.
This ruling class that left Cyprus, they're called archontes, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right. It means lords. It's a Byzantine term for lords.
And what happens afterwards? How dissimilar was the governing system in the Byzantine times, different from or the same to the feudal system that's later introduced? Because all of a sudden we have an emerging of different designations. I believe we have, and you can correct me if I'm mispronouncing this, Bariki and Francomati. Is that different from what existed prior to the Franks, or is it more or less the same?
Well, you have the pariki and some independent peasants in Byzantine times. Pariki are the serfs. They have to work 2 or 3 days a week on their lord's land. They can work for the other days on their own land, but they have to give 1/3 or 1/2 of the produce of their own land to their lords. Now, the Francomati, or the free peasants, they don't have to work on their own lands, on the lord's lands. They have their own lands, but they have to give 25% of the income of their own lands, the produce, to the lords. Okay, so that's the difference between the pariki and the Francomati. Now, on Cyprus, when the Latins conquer it, the first Richard, and then when the Guy de Lusignan becomes the Lord of Cyprus, there are 3 main types of land. You have the so-called imperial land, Basilikae, okay, which is the land of the Byzantine emperors. You have the land of the Archondes, and you have the land of the Greek Orthodox Church. Those are the 3 biggest groups of landowners. What the Lusignans do is they confiscate practically all this land, and it is given as fiefs to an incoming group of Latin nobles of mainly French, Italian, and Italian origin, okay? And these nobles are given fiefs in return for giving so many knights as a service, because according to the laws of the Lusignan kingdom, the nobles had to serve the king for something like 3 months a year when the king went to war. And so they have land in return for providing military service. And the more land they have, the more soldiers, the more knights they have to provide. Now, what happens? The Greek church only keeps a very small part of its land. Most of its land is confiscated, given to the Latin nobles. But when the Latin Church of Cyprus is founded in 1196, they are resentful because they say that all the lands of the Greek church should be given to the Latin church. The nobles and the kings do not agree, but you get 2 compromises in 1220 and 1222, where the Latin church gets some of the lands of the Greek church, not by any means all. So the Latin church owns some land, the Latin nobles own a lot of land, and the king owns quite a bit of land as well, because he has his own knights and retainers. So that is the new land system. But where you have continuity with the Byzantine system is that Cyprus is primarily an agricultural economy, even though you get some diversification, which I will discuss later on. And the other similarity is that whereas in Europe, the great lords can build their own castles and they have the right of high justice. The right of high justice means that they have their own courts which can pronounce death sentences or maiming on unruly serfs. In Cyprus, all the justice belongs to the king. Even the biggest lords, you have 2 titular princes and 3 titular counts, do not have rights of high justice. So all the justice is centralized. So in that sense, there's continuity with Byzantine period. Where, of course, you don't have continuity is that under the Byzantines, Cyprus was a province. It was a province of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. Whereas under the Lusignans, it becomes an independent kingdom. So it becomes a state.
I want to read something, and this is from Leontios Macheras.
Yes.
And I'm going to read it in Greek, and then I'm going to read it in English, its translation, because this really talks to a really important change that's happening in Cyprus at the time. And this is what he writes. And again, for those listening, this is medieval Greek, but not just medieval Greek. This is the emergence of the Cypriot dialect. And some of its phonology might actually sound familiar to the modern Cypriot ear. He writes, «Από τότες αρκέψαν να μαθάνουν φράγκικα και βαρβαρίσαν τα ρωμαϊκά, ως γιον και σήμερον, και γράφομεν φράγκικα και ρωμαϊκά, ότι εις τον κόσμο δεν εξεύρουν ίντα συντυχάνομεν». The translation there is, and when the Latin period began, men began to learn French, and their Greek became barbarous, just as it is today, when we write both French and Greek in such a way that no one in the world can say what our language is. I love that line because it's very interesting to learn that the language, the church Greek, if I can use that word, has changed, and it's been impacted irrevocably by the presence of the Franks. Now, how much French was really spoken amongst the peasants at the time? Was this a language that was really isolated to the nobility? And vice versa, were the nobles in any way familiar with Greek? And how much interaction would they actually have with serfs, for lack of a better word?
Well, the answer to the question is this. The kings of Cyprus, the Frankish kings and nobles, had Greek wet nurses, sort of suckled them and brought them up as babies. And they would have learned to speak Greek from these wet nurses. So they would have spoken colloquial Cypriot Greek, most of them to some degree. Now, most of the Greeks and the Syrians would not have spoken any French or Latin, but those Greeks working and the Syrians working in the chancery, that is to say the royal accounts office that collected the taxes and managed the royal finances, would have learned French. So a very small proportion of Greeks and Syrians working in the royal chancery, and generally perhaps a few in the army, the Signet army, would have learned French, Old French. But most Greeks would have continued, and Syrians would have continued speaking their own languages, and the French nobility would have spoken colloquial Cypriot Greek from their wet nurses, to some degree. I think you have to be very careful. Cyprus was conquered by the Latins in 1191. In 1204, the Byzantine Empire was also conquered by the Latins, and most of what is now modern Greek became Latin states. You had the Kingdom of Salonika, you had the Principality of the Morea, the Duchy of Athens. And what happened was this. Until the Frankish conquest, the Greeks actually written was, if you like, church Greek, a kind of classicizing Greek, and it was the only Greek that was written. But when the Franks conquered all these countries, because they wrote poetry and chronicles and even collections of law in colloquial French, the Greeks started imitating them, not just in Cyprus, but in Greece itself. And so colloquial Greek became a written medium. Before that, the only written medium was classical or church Greek. But from the Frankish period onwards, colloquial Greek acquires a literary dimension. And this is why this is really the first beginnings of modern Greek literature, because it begins in Crete with the Erotokritos and the Erophili, two great epic poems. It begins in Cyprus with the chronicles of Leontios Macaras and George Bustronios, and of course with the Assizes, and in other parts of the Greek world with various chronicles. So colloquial Greek is actually used, ironically, for the first time following the Latin conquest of Cyprus and other Greek lands.
You mentioned that some Greek is going to be used. I mean, the presence of wet nurses, so on and so forth. But how porous was this relationship? Was there any mobility from these lower classes looking upwards to become nobles? And if there was mobility, which I suspect there was, how open were the Franks to this movement, to this upward movement?
Well, according to the laws of the Byzantine period, you could not be a noble unless you were a Latin Christian. Okay? Now, the Greek Church until 1260 was independent of the Latin, the Roman Catholic Church. It was spiritually subject to the Greek Patriarchate of Constantinople. In 1260, though, the Greek Church acknowledged for the first time papal primacy under the terms of the Bulla Cypriot. This meant that the Greeks of Cyprus and the Syrians who were attached to the Greek Church became Uniate Christians. They kept their Orthodox customs, but they were now spiritually subject to the Church of Rome, the Roman Catholic Church, the papacy, and the Greek bishops were directly subordinate to the Latin bishops of Cyprus.
Sorry to interrupt. So is this similar to like the Ukrainian Greek rite, so that they're still
union. Yes, they're unions. They become unions. A lot of Greeks don't like to say this, but that's how it was.
Okay.
Now, what happened though is this. Once the Greeks became unions, and the Syrians, who were members of the Greek Church, technically, there was no obstacle to Greeks and Latins intermarrying because they belonged to the same church. However, the Latins wanted to keep their own ethnic identity. There was a danger that now that the Greeks had accepted papal primacy, that because the Greeks were more numerous than the Latins, if they had intermarriage, within 2 or 3 generations, there wouldn't be any Latins left on Cyprus. They would all become Greek Roman Catholics. So what did the Latins do? They passed laws saying that even though the Greeks were Catholics, because they continued to use the Greek rites, the Greek ceremonies and the divine offices, they were Greek Rite Catholics, and that in order to intermarry with the Latins, and also in order to achieve knightly, that is noble status, they had to pass from the Greek Rite to the Latin Rite. And they did this in order to keep their Latin ethnicity. So you have two types of Roman Catholic. You have the Greek Rite Catholics and the Latin Rite Catholics. And only those Greeks who passed over to the Latin Rite could become nobles. There were 4 Greek families that actually did this: the Sozomeni, the Podokathari, the Syngretiki, and the Kogostefani. Now, 4 families in the whole of Cyprus, which must have had a Greek population of 100,000, let us say, at that time. It's not very many. So very few Greeks became completely Latinized. And of course, that's exactly what the Latins wanted, because if all the Greeks became Latinized, the Latins themselves would become Hellenized. They would intermarry with the Greeks. And so you have a few Greek noble families, you have some Armenian noble families, you have a few Syrian noble families, but generally the noble families at the end of the Lusignan period, like at the beginning, are Latin. Now, another thing you get, though, in terms of upward mobility, is that Greeks and Syrians can actually buy lands. They can become fiefholders without actually becoming nobles. Because from the 14th century onwards, especially from the mid-14th century, the Cypriot crown was fighting wars against the Mamluks, against the Turks of Anatolia, and later against the Genoese. And all these wars made the Cypriot crown poorer. They needed to raise money. They did this in 2 ways. One was raising taxes among the nobles, a measure that was so unpopular that eventually King Peter I was assassinated in 1369 by angry nobles. And the second measure was by allowing Greek peasants to purchase their freedom, to leave the ranks of the pariki and become frangomati by giving something like 1,000 byzants. And this sum slowly drops. Therefore, a lot of Greeks, at least the wealthier peasants, purchase their freedom, and some of them, they become merchants and businessmen, and they can actually purchase fiefs. So you have a class of Greek landowners who are fiefholders, but they're not really nobles, because to become nobles, they have to leave the Greek Rite and they have to join the Latin Rite.
So most historians, I mean, you talked religion there for a second, and I wouldn't say most historians. I'm going to say in the popular historical narrative, religion in Cyprus is viewed at this time as a period of conflict. How vitriolic were Greek attitudes to Roman Catholicism at the time? I'm thinking of the Cantata martyrs. You know, is this something that's really overstated in modern times if we look at the past and we look at the realities on the ground?
Well, let me give a brief explanation of the martyrs. In the Roman Catholic Church, for communion, leaven, that is, sort of like bread with yeast, and unleavened bread are both acceptable.
Right.
But in the Greek Church, only leavened bread is acceptable, because the leavening of the bread is supposed to symbolize the resurrection of Christ. So the Greek Church rejects unleavened bread out of hand. Now, when the Roman Catholics came to Cyprus, the Dominicans, who wanted to impart Roman Catholicism to the Greeks, and many of them spoke Greek, got into an argument with some Greek monks at the monastery of Kadaiotis, and they told them that leavened bread was just as valid as unleavened bread was just as valid as leavened. The Greeks refused to accept this. There was an argument, and the Greek monks were imprisoned. They were held in prison for several years. One of them died, but because they persisted in refusing to accept unleavened bread, in the end, they were declared heretics. Now, the punishment for heresy was to be burnt at stake alive. Now, they were declared heretics, but because according to ecclesiastical law, Latin ecclesiastical law, clerics could not pass a death penalty. The secular authorities, the nobles, Latin ecclesiastical authorities, handed the Greek monks over to the nobles, who pronounced them heretics and executed them. They had them burnt at the stake. Now, this martyrdom of the Greek monks took place at a time when the king was a minor. He was not of age, and you had a civil war going on in Cyprus between the nobles supporting the powerful noble family of the Ibelins and other nobles who supported the German Emperor Frederick II. So it was a one-off. It took place at a time of civil war, and it took place at a time when royal authority was weak. It's also important to notice that where you do get tensions between Greeks and Latins of Cyprus, it is usually because of the interference of Latin clergy who come from Europe. I mean, they find that the native Latin clergy of Cyprus are a bit lax. They believe in, the Latin let live, minimal interference. And they actually want to make the Greeks and other groups accept Roman Catholic doctrine and to recognize the authority of the Roman Catholic Church. And this is where you get tensions. So it's not continuous tension. I mean, the Greeks were technically uniates, but in practice, as long as they were left alone to carry on with their rights, they did not look for trouble.
That incident that you described of the martyrs, that's a really isolated incident, and it would not really be reflective of the harmony that existed at this period.
Well, I mean, harmony is misleading because it suggests that they agreed with each other. I mean, it would be best to say that they agreed to differ, and that the Latins, for the most part, in religious terms, kept to themselves. The Greeks kept to themselves, and both groups tried to avoid a clash. And I'll tell you why. The Greeks did not want a clash with the Latins because the Greek church, as an institution, like all institutions, had properties and incomes, and you had Latin nobles who set their eyes on Greek properties, church properties. They tried to confiscate them, to seize them. And the only protection the Greek church had against these grasping Latin nobles was to appeal to the authority of the papacy. So the Greek church could not reject the papacy, because if they did so, they would be heretics, and the nobles could seize all their properties and incomes, and they would cease to exist as a church, because no institution can exist without having income and properties. Now, on the Latins, on the other hand, did not want to push the Greeks too far, because the Greeks were the majority population. They could rebel, or they could leave the island. And given that the Latin kingdom of Cyprus was practically surrounded by Muslim states, by the Mamluks of Egypt and Syria, by the Anatolian Turks, they did not want tensions within Cyprus. I mean, the Latin nobility were conscious that there were very few. Within Cyprus, the majority of the population was Greek and Eastern Christians, and around Cyprus, the majority of the population was Muslim. So there was a kind of peaceful coexistence.
Would you characterize this as a period of financial growth? And if it is this unevenly divided by the newly landed aristocracy and the Greeks? And would that go far in explaining why there wasn't many rebellions at this time? I mean, if you compare it to Crete, I know that Crete had many different uprisings throughout its Venetian period.
Because in Crete and the Peloponnese, both these areas were conquered after the Latin conquest of Constantinople, and so the Byzantine aristocrats of these areas, the Ottomans, they had no bolster. They couldn't just escape to Constantinople, because Constantinople was itself Latin and became part of the Latin Empire. So they had to stay put. And because they stayed put, they provided a leadership for if they wanted to rebel. If the peasants wanted to rebel and the nobles themselves wanted to rebel, and quite often they rebelled in order to get more concessions for themselves, they were put and they could provide a leadership to the peasants. That's why Crete, and to a lesser extent the Peloponnese, have more rebellions than Cyprus does. But now coming to the economic question.
Yeah.
Under the Lusignan, Cyprus continued to have an agricultural economy, but there were two changes. You had a lot of Venetian, Genoese, and Catalan merchants and Provençal merchants visiting Cyprus. And so Cyprus became integrated in the Western trading networks, which extended all the way from the Balearic Islands, from Spain to the Black Sea. Because the Genoese and the Venetians had Mediterranean-wide trading networks, so did the Catalans, and Cyprus was integrated into these trading networks. This meant that Cypriot oil, grain, sugar, wine was all purchased and exported to Western Europe. There was a demand for Cypriot agricultural goods. This made the nobles wealthy, but it also made the peasants wealthier, and this is why, when the crown needs money to fight its wars in the 14th century, there are thousands of peasants who are able to buy their way out of serfdom because they had made money from producing more agricultural goods. And the nobles made money from these agricultural goods, which they sold to the merchants. But there was another way in which Cyprus made money. Cyprus became a big stopover in the carrying trade. Now, the carrying trade was a trade in which Western textiles, timber, and iron was sent to the lands of the Muslim East, and in return, the Westerners got spices, especially pepper, silks, precious stones, and gold. So you have this trade, and because Cyprus is a stopover, profits are made from this trade. And when, after the loss of the last Latin possessions in Syria and Palestine, Holy Land, the papacy placed an embargo on direct trade between West European merchants and Muslim countries, what happens? The West European merchants come to Cyprus, the Muslims come to Cyprus, or native Cypriot merchants, Latins, Greeks, Armenians, Syrians, they buy goods from nearby Muslim countries and they bring them to Cyprus, and they make very fat profits selling these goods to Western merchants. So the time of the papal embargo is the high point in the Cypriot economy because the Cypriots make a lot of money as middlemen. And so until the mid-14th century, the Cypriot economy is on an upswing. What happens though after the mid-14th century? In 1344, the papal embargo ceases because the popes and the Western Europe wish to have peaceful trade with the Mamluks. And the biggest threat, Muslim threat to Western Europe, is no longer the Mamluks who rule Egypt and Syria, but the Ottoman Turks. So, no embargo against Egypt and Syria, no Cypriot middlemen making profits because now the Western merchants can sail directly to Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. And this is when King Peter sacks Alexandria to try and revive Cypriot trade. There's an expensive war with the Mamluks. The Genoese are angry because it damages their trade. And after Peter's death, the death of King Peter I, in 1373, they invade Cyprus, they capture Famagusta, and they keep it for the next 90 years. And because Cyprus is Famagusta, rather, is the main Cypriot port, Cyprus thereafter becomes impoverished. So you have a period of economic growth for the first 150 odd years of Frankish rule, and then for the next 90 odd years, you have economic decline.
I was also struck by the amount of Italians that arrive in Cyprus at this time. I mean, we have Genoese, Venetians, Piacenzans, Sicilians. What brought these particular groups to Cyprus? I suspect that is banking one of the draws.
Banking is one of the draws because the Italians were buying up Cypriot agricultural produce from the nobles. They were buying up luxury goods from Cypriots and Muslim merchants who brought these goods to Cyprus. And so they wanted cash and they wanted bills of exchange. So you do have banking. And one thing to remember is that you have Italian and Catalan merchants and even Provençal southern French merchants who either visit Cyprus on a regular basis or are even resident. Now, because of piracy, Western merchants going to Cyprus or anywhere else in the Eastern Mediterranean never took their wives with them, or or sisters or daughters or other female members of the family. They left them at home. However, because they had, let us say, biological needs, quite a lot of them had native Cypriots girlfriends or concubines among the slave population. And I think even today it is said that 20% of Cypriot DNA is Italian. And this does not surprise me at all, because there were we had hundreds and thousands of Italian merchants living in Cyprus and Catalans and visiting it. You had these illicit relationships between either serfs, free Cypriot women, or slaves, Greek and Cypriot slaves. And so this meant that there was unofficially, but really, a lot of influx of Italian blood among the Cypriot population.
Right.
We know this from the wills because there are thousands of notarial deeds. And in some of the deeds, the merchants say, I leave so much to my mistress, so much to my female slave. I free her and I give her the house. I leave some money so that my son by my female slave, so-and-so, Maria or Helen, will become apprentice to so-and-so and learn a trade. They actually provided for their concubines and for the illegitimate sons and daughters that they had by these concubines. They even provided dowries for the illegitimate daughters. So this is actually going on. It's happening.
Now, was intermarriage common?
Also common because, you see, if the concubines were not Roman Catholic and the merchants were Roman Catholic, they belonged to different Christian denominations and they couldn't marry. Unless, of course, as sometimes happened, the Greek or the Syrian non-Latin women agreed to become members of the Roman Catholic Church. This did happen. So there was some intermarriage, but there were a lot of illicit relationships.
Greeks, Syrians, Armenians, Latins. Eventually, it's my understanding that a lot of these groups we know identity is very fluid. It's moldable, it's adaptable, it changes. And I suspect that is this what characterizes the post-Lusinian period? Do many of these groups I don't mean to say disappear, but do they eventually blend into the predominant Greek identity? Is that eventually what ends up happening?
Only group who do blend in, and I've written an article about this, are the Syrian Melkites. You have 5 groups of Syrians on Cyprus. They're all Christian, but they're 5 different groups. You have the Jacobites, who are Monophysite Christians. You have the Maronites, who are Roman Catholics who use the Arabic rites. You have the Melkites, who are Greek Rite Christians. And you have the Nestorians, who follow a clergyman called Nestorius, who lived in the 14th century, was condemned as a heretic. And you even have the Copts, who are Egyptian Monophysites. Now, when Latin sources, either in French or in Latin, talk about Syrians, they're always talking about the Syrian Melkites who follow the Greek church. Now, the Melkites developed their identity in Syria and in Palestine as Chalcedonian Christians. Now, the Chalcedonians are Christians who believe that Christ has a divine and a human nature. He has 2 natures working in perfect harmony. And Chalcedonian Christians include the Greek Orthodox Christians, the Roman Catholic Christians, and today the Protestants. Most Christians in the world are Chalcedonian. It just so happened, though, that in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Copts and the Jacobites were Monophysites, and the Nestorians followed Nestorius. So, the Melkites, who developed the identity in Syria and Palestine, developed this identity in opposition to the non-Chalcedonian Christians on one hand, and to the Muslim population on the other. But when the Melkites came to Cyprus, they discovered that most Cypriots were Chalcedonian Christians. The Roman Catholic ruling class, the Franks or the Latins, were Chalcedonian, and the Greek majority were also Chalcedonian. And so it was very easy for the Melkites to intermarry with Latins and with Greeks, and this is what they did. And this is why today on Cyprus, there are no Melkites. You have Maronites and you have Armenians because they did not intermarry, at least not completely with the Latins. But you don't have Melkites because as Chalcedonians, it was easier for them to intermarry with Greeks and Latins. This is what they did. They are, if you like, a lost minority.
Now, when it comes to cultural exchanges, that's one area that I find incredibly fascinating. I think the most easily identifiable influences that happen in this period is language. The amount of French loanwords in Greek, Italian loanwords, that is quantifiable. Are there any other social changes that we can identify today? Like, is there any continuity that we can identify from this period? And it could be even and this might be really difficult to find out, but is it possible even music, we can see continuity from this time period in the 15th and 14th century?
Definitely continuity in music, because there's a very important manuscript in Turin. It's known as the Torino II manuscript, in which you have elements of Latin and Greek music, because you have a Latin or rather a Savoyard French music with Cypriot themes, such as celebrations of Saint Hilaire and Saint Epiphanius of Salamis, and the composers were influenced by Greek popular music. So you have a blend of music. You also have a blend in iconography and then architecture, which I pointed out earlier. The Cypriot dialect of the time, the Greek Cypriot dialect, has a lot of French, Italian, and Catalan loanwords, and some of them are still present in present-day Cypriot Greek. And the other continuity, of course, is in the cuisine. I think that some elements of Cypriot cuisine may be influenced by Italian cuisine. For example, pasticcio, which is made in Italy, is the same as the Cypriot macaroni di forno. And you have references to this dish in notarial documents of 15th century Famagusta.
Oh, wow.
Yes, exactly. And also costumes, because the Cypriot costume was influenced by at least the Cypriot upper class costume was influenced by fashions in France and Western Europe. Indeed, Ludolf of Suttheim, a German traveler, says that the women of Famagusta dressed more richly than the queens of France. They were the wives of the wealthy merchants. And so the latest fashions from Europe would have come to Cyprus. And the other thing that came to Cyprus, if you look at Cypriot Gothic architecture, the most up-to-date trends in the Ile-de-France, the area around Paris, and in the Rhineland, influenced the construction of Saint Sophia in Famagusta and in Nicosia, Saint Sophia in Nicosia, and St. Nicholas in Famagusta, the Latin cathedral churches. So the Gothic architecture you get in Cyprus is not transmitted secondhand from the Latinese, from Syria and Palestine. It comes here firsthand. You have architects and stonemasons coming from the Rhineland and from France to plan the construction of Gothic churches in Cyprus. So in many ways, they are very au courant, very up to date with the fashions, the architectural trends that we have in Western Europe. And this influences Cypriot Greek as well, of course.
Without going too far out of our Frankish period, and my purpose of this episode is really to provide an overview of this time period. And so I'm not trying to go into the Venetian period necessarily, but we do know that eventually Venice inherits Cyprus and Venice loses Cyprus to the Ottoman Empire. And if I'm not mistaken, many Venetians are banished from the island. Now, over these hundreds of years, what happens to this established Frankish nobility? Do they eventually blend into Cypriot society and become essentially Cypriot?
Well, during the Venetian period, before the Venetian period, the aristocracy are enriched, particularly with Catalans, because the penultimate king of Cyprus, James II, took the throne from his half-sister, the legitimate Queen Charlotte, with the use of mercenaries who came from Sicily, from Catalonia, from Greece, from Armenia, even from the Mamluk lands, Circassians, but the majority were Catalans, and a lot of them were ennobled. So the French nobility have a big Catalan infusion under King James II, which continues in the Venetian period, because although the Venetians expel some of the Catalans, others are allowed to stay. So you still have a Latin nobility. The Venetians keep the Latin nobles, and they allow them to have their estates and their serfs. But one thing they do abolish is the High Court. You still have the Court of Burgesses, but any appeals are dealt with in the courts of Venice. So the High Court, if you like, ceases to exist, and the Court of Appeal is now in Venice. And following the Ottoman conquest, some of the nobles are killed in fighting. Some of them are captured and they're ransomed, or they're not ransomed, they remain slaves. Others, they disappear, I suppose, and they either blend into the Greek population, and a small group become Muslims to keep their estates, and so they blend into the new Turkish Cypriot population. So they have varying fates. Now, regarding the other classes, I mean, we know that you have Copts in Ottoman Cyprus, so they're still around. The Maronites survive. The small Jewish communities survive. I mean, the Greeks survive, and the Armenians also survive, although in the 19th century they are reinforced by a big influx from Anatolia. So most of the ethnic groups that existed in New Sigmund and Venetian Cyprus still survived throughout the Ottoman and British period.
I'm really glad we had this conversation, because I find this period incredibly fascinating, and I think just the sentence you started off at the start of this interview, describing this as it's an incredibly rich period.
May I interrupt? Tourists who visit Cyprus today, the biggest monuments are the Venetian walls of Nicosia and Famagusta, walls, the Latin cathedrals of St. Sophia and Nicosia and St. Nicholas of Famagusta, together with all the other Latin churches, or the remains of them. So apart from the Roman remains, the most impressive remains in Cyprus today in terms of scale are the Gothic and Venetian remains. So, and also in literary production, you have chronicles written in Italian, Old French, Greek. You have poetry written in Venetian Italian, which is also translated in Cypriot Greek. You have law codes in Old French and in Cypriot Greek. So they have a tremendously diverse literary production. You have architecture, including, I mean, if you go to some of the icon museums in Nicosia and in Paphos, even though the icons are called Byzantine, most of them date from the Frankish period. The reason they're called Byzantine is because the form of art is Byzantine, even though it's Byzantine iconography influenced by Italian, Armenian, Eastern Syrian traditions. But most of the icons date from the Frankish period, the Frankish and Venetian period. So in terms of iconography, literary production, legal texts, and architecture, I would say that it could be perhaps the richest period in Cypriot history.
And but lamentably, if we're talking about visual or direct interaction that you have with a lot of these landmarks, Most, and I might be wrong, but most are in northern Cyprus, which I think it removes a lot of that immediate interaction that someone visiting Cyprus would have. Yes, of course, you do have the walls in Nicosia, the Venetian walls, but those lofty castles on the Pentadactylos range. You think of the cathedrals again in Lefkosia. Unfortunately, I think most don't get a chance to interact with them and view them. I don't know if you agree with that.
Well, you see, what you say is true, because the biggest cities for the Franks were Nicosia and Famagusta. Famagusta is completely under Turkish control, and Nicosia has a Turkish sector and a Greek sector. And when the Turks conquered Cyprus, they turned the Latin churches into mosques, or at least the biggest ones, cathedrals, but not the Greek churches. I mean, the Greek churches, a few churches in the villages became mosques when the Greeks themselves in those villages converted to Islam. But it was the Latin monuments that were Islamized. The other thing to remember is that the main centers of Frankish concentration in Cyprus were always Nicosia and Famagusta. So, because the Turkish occupation covers those areas, this is why a lot of the Frankish monuments are in the area controlled by Turkey. There is something, though, which is worth noting. I mean, during the British period, both Greek and Turkish nationalism grew on Cyprus. So the Greeks and the Turks of Cyprus identified increasingly with either mainland Greece, which became a kingdom in 1830, or the Ottoman Empire, later Republican Turkey. From 1923, Turkey was a republic, and so the Turkish Cypriots had a national state, a Turkish national state with it to identify. And so in many ways, the Frankish legacy was unwanted by both communities. The Greeks didn't identify with it because they strongly felt to be Orthodox. They saw the Franks as aged oppressors. And the Turks didn't identify with it because the Franks were not even Muslim. They were infidels. They were Christians. So there is this dimension as well.
Right. I meant to ask this question. I'll ask it of you now. The narrative, political history, it's, from what I understand, it's pretty easy to synthesize based on the major chronicles that exist. But for Cyprus in particular, as a historian, so I'm asking you as a personal question, what are some of those challenges in piecing together the social and economic history? Or are there? Because it does sound like there's a lot of information out there at times.
A lot of information, but it's lopsided. I'll tell you why. It's lopsided geographically because it contains the information, especially the notarial deeds, which have a lot of information on the economy of Cyprus. They originate mainly from Famagusta and to a lesser extent from Nicosia. It is also lopsided ethnically because these notarial deeds are written in Latin and they show the economic activity of the Italian, Catalan, and the French Provençal merchants, but not about the Armenians, the Greeks, and the Syrians. So you have ethnic lopsidedness, you have a geographic lopsidedness, and you also have a chronological lopsidedness because these notarial deeds, you have thousands from the period 1296 to 1310. You have quite a few hundred from 1360 to 1364. So 1371, 1360 to 1371. You have a few hundred from 1444 to 1458. And for the rest of the period, which is about 300 or 400 years, you have a few dozen. So you have a chronological lopsidedness, a geographic lopsidedness, and an ethnic lopsidedness. So yes, I mean, there are thousands of documents, but they're not evenly distributed.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Nico, this has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for participating in this.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be on this talk. The sooner you publish, the better. And I hope you have lots of more programs on this podcast. I think it's a fantastic initiative because it is releasing less known aspects of the history of Cyprus, which are very interesting and very fruitful of study, to a much wider audience. And something like this podcast can enable historians to reach out to a wider interested public. And I'm glad that we got there in the end. I mean, I was really worried. It was quite hairy.
I know. But we saw it through.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you so much.
Have a great time. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye.